Hey everyone, I'm Justin Toomer, Design Principal. Welcome to our mini learning session. I'm excited to talk to you about ways you consider equity in your work. My focus will be on connecting and uncovering and defining the work for yourself today. And so in order to start with ourselves, I have a few questions that I want to ask you. To build a little bit of trust, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and think about these questions yourself. Are your eyes closed? All right, so the first question I have for you is, who are you? Who do people think you are? Who do you pretend to be? And I ask you again, who are you? Now those questions are important. I want you to hold those answers in the back of your mind as we're going through our session today, because it's so important that you know who you are, but you're also aware of your space in the world. And so our goal today of really unpacking equity and thinking about how we fit in it ourselves, it's first important that we define where we're going. What are we talking about? And for us, Education Elements, the way that we're defining educational equity is really, it's a recognition. It's a recognition that a lot of the barriers that marginalized students face, a lot of the gaps that students face as well, that our teachers face as we're trying to solve a lot of the issues in our classrooms. Those gaps, they came as a part of really intentional and deliberate actions. It's not about who defined those actions, but it's the fact that the system perpetuates those actions to this day. And so for us, it's important to recognize that those gaps and inequities that many of our students face are a cause of deliberate action, and therefore require that we put just as much, if not more, energy and resources towards developing a more deliberate solution. All right, so I want you to think about that definition for a moment there, and I want you to find some ways to connect that to your work. When it comes to dedicating resources necessary to shift systems or to change the inequities that we're seeing in our classrooms and schools, where do you feel like your school or your district or your community is strong? Where do you feel like some work could be done? Thinking of those areas of focus, we understand that it can be a big undertaking to try to shift and dismantle these systems and inequities that we're seeing in our classroom. Because the work can be nebulous and difficult to access and understand, we've tried to create a simple process that folks can engage in to invite as many people to the table to develop solutions that we believe and have seen can shift systems. So it's a 3-step system that also starts with a step 0. That's important for you to think about here when it comes to shifting inequities and ultimately connecting with the biases that we may have ourselves. And I start with that piece for an important reason. The first step, step 0, is to connect with yourself and cede power where necessary. It's important that we know who we are, the biases that we're coming with, the privileges that we're coming with, to better understand ways we can be allies and leaders in this work. The first step, once that important work is done, is to actually connect to the real issue. Oftentimes, when we're engaging in equity work, in wanting to support students in our classrooms, we try to find the direct solution and the direct answer to get that done. And often, the answer is truly something that's underlying and not always visible. So it's important that you do the work, you ask the right questions to actually connect to the real challenge that you're trying to solve. The second piece is we cannot solve these problems alone. The next step is to really include as many viable and impactful stakeholders as possible, so that way your decision-making table is as diverse and rich and full of ideas as you want your schools to be. And then finally, the last step is ultimately create. We're not bringing all those people to the table for nothing. Let's get those folks together and let's get a lot of action steps to the table, and let's create solutions based upon qualitative and quantitative measures. Once we get those steps in place, we do believe that that process can help us eradicate inequities that we see in our classrooms and ultimately make those changes that we want to see. All right, so again, it really is important that before we dive into all of those different steps, that we ultimately start with ourselves. So I'm going to ask you to grab a writing utensil and something to write on so we can answer a couple of quick questions and do a little bit of journaling. Alright, so the first question I want you to reflect on is this. Why are you here in this session? What ultimately brought you here? Are there inequities that you've seen or that you've experienced that you feel like you can change or we can make a change in our classrooms? Be as specific as possible. Feel free to name names or tell stories. This is for you. Speaking of yourself, I want you to also think about the set of privileges that you might be bringing to the table. Are there any blind spots or abilities or areas of access that you have that others may not have that ultimately allow you a leg up? We all have them. Great. Taking a moment to reflect on why you're here and those privileges. Take a quick second to see, are there any blind spots that those privileges may have in terms of impacting your why? Alright, now that we've done that quick check, we can finally begin. So let's get started with step 1, connecting to the challenge. The first step in truly connecting to the work and unpacking the challenge that you want to solve is to be clear about the purpose that you believe equity plays in your schools. Do you see equity work as being an opportunity to create equal outcomes for all students, where you make sure that the classroom opportunities that students have access to are the same regardless of their identifiers? Or is it really important to you that your school is there to close and eliminate the academic gaps that many students of marginalized populations face? Or do you recognize the structural oppression that is ultimately foundationally built within our systems and believe that our system needs to be changed at that level to dismantle it? Or do you believe that our students bring rich cultural identities to the table and that in order to truly make an equitable environment, we need to honor the cultural capital that all of our diverse populations bring? Which of those purposes resonate with you the most? Let me know. Now that you've taken some time to define the purpose that matters most to you, that you most connect with, it's important that we get to step 2, and that's including marginalized stakeholders and voices at the table. We want to get to the finish line, but we don't want to get there alone, and we won't get there alone. And so this step is vitally important. You need to take some time and ask yourself some questions. Traditionally, when I'm making decisions, what voices are most impacted? Are those voices at my table making those decisions with me? Do I have an avenue for inviting those voices to my decision-making table? Am I invited to their decision-making table? Are we collaborating together? Think about those questions, and now let's start to take a few steps to shift them. First things first, let's create focus groups to allow ourselves opportunities to really build empathy and build a connection with the communities that we serve and want to impact the most. How can we then use direct opportunities in multiple means of communication to create true invitations and authentic, meaningful opportunities for folks to contribute to our decisions? How can we be as specific as possible about the criteria for success when it comes to this work so we can allow other folks to access and better understand the ways they can be impactful for our team? These are steps you can take to most authentically invite and include those folks who you want to impact to the decision-making table. Nothing will get done without them. Whew. Okay, so we did some really important work. We have a little bit more to do. So now our next step, now that we've taken time to think about ourselves and reflect, take some time to think about where we want to go and the purpose of our equitable work, thought about who this work impacts and how we can include their voices at the table. Now that we've done that, it's important we start to build. It's time to create. We now need to create prototypes that allow us to continue to progress in that work, get small bites of data that allow us to reflect and iterate upon those prototypes to ultimately create the most viable solution. So, what does that look like? We come back to that initial criteria for success, and we want to break that definition down into a few different areas. In the short term, What does this look like to make these small tweaks tomorrow, the next day, and to keep this work up at the top of our minds? What is that bite-sized step that we can do now to keep everyone engaged? In the medium term, what is an intentional shift that we'll need to make at a systems level, at a group level, that will take some time, will take some energy, but ultimately that investment will pay off down the line? And speaking of down the line, what are those big aspirational goals that we have that will really stoke folks' imagination and their energy to keep them going in this work when it gets most difficult? How do we want to change the game now that we have all these impactful stakeholders present? Get everybody to the table, define those prototypes, break that problem down, and get to work. At Education Elements, we recognize that inequities are a product of design. And we recognize that because we also truly believe that those inequities can be redesigned. And we feel like you have the power to do so. And so with all the work that we've done in mind, I ask you a few questions again. Close your eyes. Who are you? Who do people think you are? Who do you pretend to be? And one final time, who are you? Know that you are enough and that you can impact the systems and inequities that many students face. You have everything you need right now. I'm so excited to engage in this work with you. Good luck.
Hi friends, I'm Crystal.
I'm Jessica.
Thank you so much for sharing some time with us today and joining us for a conversation. Now that you've gone through Connect with our colleague Justin, it's time to talk about Include. Include is about explicitly including voices of our stakeholders to reimagine solutions, with an emphasis on the voices of the most marginalized and least represented.
We know that when examining and redesigning inequitable systems, it is crucial to connect with your community, especially parts of your community that often are left out of that conversation.
At Education Elements, this connects to our definition of educational equity. We believe that educational equity is the recognition the barriers that marginalized students face are due to deliberate actions and biases, and therefore requires us to dedicate a greater amount of resources to remove them.
In order to recognize what resources are needed to remove those barriers, we must deliberately seek out the voices of the community and the people that barriers are designed to exclude. An example of why now is the time to think about how you intentionally seek out marginalized voices is around resiliency of in-person, hybrid, or distance learning models. Are you making decisions and resource allocations based on the voices of all, or actively finding out how to improve for the system that is currently least effective for?
In this video, you will hear about known barriers you may encounter once people are in the room.
Throughout the video, we will leave you with some reflection questions to prompt you to continue thinking about your own practices and your organization's practices.
So let's jump in.
So let's talk about the barriers that may hinder diverse voices from contributing. One of the barriers that often occurs revolves around the fragility of an invitation. You only invite underrepresented groups to the table for major decisions once. If they are unavailable or unresponsive the first time, is that the only time they will be able to contribute? Inclusive decision-making looks like multiple opportunities to engage, add perspective, and support the work.
Another barrier to bring diverse perspectives to the room is about influence. Do you truly intend to cede or share power with those invited? Do you plan to step back, and make room for diverse voices to shape the direction in which you are going. Inclusive decision-making is not about the presence of diverse voices, but also about allowing those diverse voices to inform, influence, and shape decisions.
But then there is also the question of the duration of your efforts. Are you planning to just make one finite attempt to address inequity in your community? Do you look at inequity as something that can be remedied through a single approach, a one-off training? Consistency communicates commitment. That lets those on the margins know that you are committed to truly shifting the systems and culture, and that makes for a much more enticing invitation.
Inclusive decision-making is not just about including multiple voices. It's also about inclusive strategies for how you incorporate diversity. Do you place an undue burden on those at the margin to generate all your ideas to address your equity challenges? Do you limit their influence and input to only address the areas that you are most comfortable with? Or limit them to the areas that you seem most appropriate for them to speak up?
Here's the thing. Those are all barriers to getting diverse voices in the room. But what happens once they're there? Does your way of making decisions leave little to no room for nuanced and inclusive approaches? Do you often think in terms of either or reject the notion of both and?
You already have someone in the room, at the table, who typically dominates the conversation. Maybe you even repeat ideas and suggestions made by others as if it's their own. They may even explain the nature of racism, sexism, or other forms of oppression on behalf of the other diverse voices, instead of allowing others to speak for themselves. If you're inviting underrepresented voices into the room, do they have to compete with others in the room to speak or compete? Who's the loudest voice?
Do you have someone who often is invited into the room, has a seat at the table, and represents an underrepresented group, but you treat them like they are an exception? They are uniquely different from their race, group, or demographic based on assumptions you've made about that group. Do you undermine their contributions through comments about their exceptionalism relative to their community? These kinds of behaviors can foster resentment, insecurity, exclusivity, and a host of other sentiments that prevent underrepresented voices from feeling empowered.
As you're discussing challenges in the community or culture, do you focus solely on your intent as a leader or the intent of the person who may have caused the harm? Do you not acknowledge the impact of that? You solely look at the intent or use intent as a way to minimize impact? Are you creating another barrier to include diverse voices and acknowledging their experience?
So we know what can happen to prevent voices from making it to the room. And then we know what happens when they are finally in the room. But what happens after the room? Do they have a reason to be afraid of potential backlash from you or others in the community? Sometimes when underrepresented voices come to the table, truths about harm are shared, and that truth can make others feel uncomfortable or convicted. Retaliation can look like a lot of different things in the community. Does it have a look in yours?
You'll also want to be on the lookout for feedback. You're constantly calling on the same people to help make your future leadership and policies more equitable and inclusive. There's a possibility that they are maybe exhausted or burnt out by the beginning. You acknowledge the burden, you celebrate their contribution, support their wellness, distribute the responsibility with others in the community. You empower them to say no to requests.
When they do contribute, do you let them know the outcome? Do you close the loop on what decisions have been made? Or do you ask for their input and leave them to figure out the end result on their own? People want to know and see the fruits of their labor. Supporting leaders and communities in creating more equitable and just cultures and systems is labor. Emotional, intellectual, and sometimes even manual labor. Those who have a hand in shaping the outcome ought to know what the outcome will be.
So thank you so much for joining us. This is just the beginning. And this is a preview of our Include guide that will come out in the next month or so. And that this will help as we think about how we uplift voices. So thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, my name is David Hardy and I'm a managing partner and VP of People and Culture at Education Elements. I have this picture of my cousin and my son. This cute little picture when they're two little kids looking at each other for the first time, and unfortunately they have not been able to see each other again. See, my child is one of two boys who will have financial access to things that his cousin won't. It comes with a type of privilege. The kind of privilege, though, that makes my dad proud when he's able to explain to his colleagues what his sons do. However, the lived realities of those two babies in that picture couldn't be more alike. Kids that look like my son and my cousin will often be labeled, be told that their names are too hard to say, and the classes they need must be easier, and they won't have access to what they need. I think about this as I watch my son take his two-wheel bike without training wheels on and ride down the hill with such joy as he screams with so much happiness. But I could see one day and have that fear in which that joy will be seen as anger, and he's being told to slow down, that it's untimely. Right now, his black skin joyfully rides through a cul-de-sac neighborhood, but his mere presence will one day have the impact mine has in areas of privilege. On any given day, my son will be holding my hand and we're walking across the street and a white woman clutches her purse. Or we're followed in stores, or worse yet, told to go back to where we came from. My degree from Colgate University in economics cannot calculate the judgment that I feel, or my master's degree from Columbia University isn't going to overcome the challenges that we see when people see us. It never really came full circle until we bought not only our first, second, but our third home here in DC, when I really was concerned. We looked at a wonderful neighborhood, found out that they wanted our papers for employment and where we worked, which was perfectly fine and perfectly normal, a process we went through with two other homes. However, this time they came back again to verify our employment and then came back again asking us to verify the verification. To some that may not seem odd at all, but to me as a black man in America, I can't help to question what was the real intent behind their questioning. They were trying to slow me down on my bike. As I look at my cousin and my son in that picture, I want to make sure that their dreams are not deferred. I'm hoping that the new reality that they see is one that starts with our humanity, that connects us and will connect us to a better tomorrow. Our nation's children are in classrooms, and classrooms are not the problem. It's the systems behind it. Our leaders are investing a lot of time and resources that may solve one problem, but not all of them. Not the problem that divides us and perpetuates the idea of the haves and the have-nots. The generations of intentional system design are founded in inequity. They're founded with the framework that allows schools and districts to utilize policies and practices and protocols that are inequitable, that may create incremental change, but will not uproot racism. By making better ways for things to be done, the more people will see success. Our path to success is through the systems of educational equity methodology or SEAM here at Educational Elements that we designed. There are three core components of the framework. We believe for any system to improve, they need to connect, include, and create the people in their community to create the change in action. Unfortunately, we don't go far because of the fears of race and racism, but the reality is those things are real and we need to address them. The best way to address them is to get to the base of the systems, not the symptom. Once we're able to do so, we're able to bring the right people to the table and connect us to the problem that is in front of us. We spend significant amount of time trying to decide and understand what the problem is with the community who is deeply impacted by the inequities. From there, we create a space through our include phase so that leaders across the community can sit at the same table to understand the choices they need to make for their school district and for their school community. Those who are sitting at the table are the ones that are going to drive the systemic change. And that is not your typical district decision maker. It is those that are impacted by the changes that are needed for systems to be equitable. From the include phase, we move to the create phase, where the solutions generated at that decision-making table with the community are now looking at prototypes in which they will be tested to see how well they will work and ensure that the right ones are creating the equity we want to see for school children across this country. As a country, we have begun to look at educational equity to improve academic outcomes and access for kids, but we need to do it across all of our systems to ultimately make the world a better place for you and me, and for every child screaming with joy as they ride down the side of a hill.